Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Benjamin Hebblethwaite of the University of Florida presents a talk entitled A Transatlantic History of Haitian Voodoo. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Dr. Benjamin Hebblethwaite.
Hello, Matthew. Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Glad to sort of revisualize an aspect of Gainesville once again. A couple years removed from me.
Indeed, this is what a Gainesville office looks like.
It does seem familiar. Mine was very narrow. It was almost like a hallway, and I had a couch that fit perfectly at the back of it, and that's just how wide my office was. Essentially, was a couch width.
Not bad. You need a fold-out couch for naps.
Well, that was what its intent was. It was a nice, comfy couch in my office in the art department. So tonight we're gonna have a discussion about the transatlantic history of Haitian voodoo, or voodoo in general, I should say, and how it sort of came to situate itself into the Caribbean and then migrate elsewhere into the Americas. I think that's safe to say. So we have an ambitious goal laid out before us in the coming hour, but I think between the two of us, we will endeavor our best.
Absolutely.
I guess I want to ask you more of a biographical question to start, because I like beginning research with biography. What drew you into a study of voodoo and its history, essentially, as a cultural history?
Right. Well, my undergraduate training was in religious studies at the University of Missouri. So already at that point in my study of religions, world religions, I knew that Haitian Vodou was an important African diaspora tradition and that had been understudied. So over time, I started studying, this is a bit tangential, but Afrikaans in South Africa, where I was born and went in the 1990s to reconnect with family. And so getting into Afrikaans, language formation, creolization in South Africa, I started to think about that type of language formation process in the Americas, where I resided. So I was in South Africa for a year at that time, and I was planning on going back and starting graduate school, continuing with graduate school, essentially leaving one MA and starting another. So Haitian Creole immediately stood out in my mind at that time as a student of Afrikaans in South Africa as the most important example of a Creole language in our hemisphere. And then also because it was home to the most important African diaspora religious tradition, it matched my background in religious studies and my interest in those traditions and my sense that they had been under-examined. So that intuition and inclination led me to actually purchase a copy of the Haitian Creole Bible, which is a big part of all of this, one way or another. But having been raised in a Bible reading family, it was natural for me to purchase that book and start reading it and acquiring Haitian Creole on the basis of French and experience studying languages. I just started reading the Creole Bible. And shortly thereafter, so this was mid-1990s, I met my first Haitian friend. So returning from South Africa, ordered my Haitian Creole Bible, and shortly thereafter met my first Haitian language partner and friend who met with me at a cafe and exchanged English for Creole. And he turned out to be from the Vodou faith tradition. So that was completely coincidental. I mean, I had no expectation that my first Haitian language partner and friend would have that culture and would represent it with such confidence and and strength. So, including providing me with 200 songs in Haitian Creole that he wrote down himself to preserve the memory of his family and his mother's Vodou songs. So already as a student, I inherited these 200 handwritten Vodou songs provided to me by my Haitian Creole language instructor, who is essentially roughly my age, a little bit younger, but my equal. And he wanted me to study the language and the religion of his family and of himself through these texts. So that was huge for my own journey into Haitian studies, into research on the religion. It was this friendship and those texts, written Haitian Creole texts. I mean, that's like Moses is providing you with the 10 Commandments, This is a sacred writing of the religion. So I took that very seriously and completely changed my direction and my emphasis as a researcher. So that's sort of how it all started brewing. And then, of course, in the 1990s, at that same time, I started purchasing Haitian music, whatever I could find, which was not much. Think about 1996 and think about West Lafayette, Indiana, which is where I was starting my MA in French literature at Purdue. One of 2 MAs, started 3, finished 2. Glutton for punishment. Most academics are one way or another, monastically gluttonous for punishment. So that's sort of how I sort of caught on fire.
Okay.
So,
for the benefit of others watching who probably have a lot less exposure than me and certainly less than you, I want to sort of take this in 5 parts, not to overcomplicate it. I want to take it in the following: the forming of the culture in Africa, then a shift into a European contact, then what I'm going to call transculturation 1, which will be sort of missionary exposure, and then the middle passage toward the Caribbean. Then I'll call the second one transculturation 2 as a shift to the Americas. And then part 5 of this, I want to think about sort of these morphings, or as I'm going to call them right now, bastardizations and misconceptions. In other words, the Hollywoodization that sort of like changes everything, which is why I use the word bastardization, which I think is fair in that context.
Oh, it is. To refer to Hollywood, it is.
Okay. So if you could talk to us a bit about sort of where the tradition sort of comes from, in terms of like which aspects in Africa, which cultural groups specifically, if you could, narrow it down to maybe 3 of the major ones in which you're sort of getting the archetypes from, and the various spiritual beings and iconography. I think that would be a good place to start.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I should point out to begin with that Haitian Vodou, accretes or accumulates the rituals and traditions of multiple African nations or ethnic groups. So it is a coherent synthesis of numerous distinct African ethnic and national traditions. So what you see in Haiti is not what you see in West or West Central Africa, in the sense that Haiti has taken these diverse traditions and reformulated them, you might say even perfected them, and emerged with an umbrella. It's called Service Guinéen, an umbrella tradition that houses under highly coherent forms these diverse African traditions. So, for example, Rada, which derives from the town of Alada, forms a rite, its own rite, the single most important rite in the Haitian religion. Then, in addition, from the same region, for example, we can talk about Nago, which reflects Yoruba rites and traditions and spirits. Or we can talk about Mai, which reflects the Mai nation, language, traditions, spirit, or Gede, which reflects the Gedevi people and their rites and traditions, and exists in its own separate self-standing tradition next to Rada, Nago, Mai. We can also add Ibo. So now we're just talking about the Bight of Benin, which is, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, roughly that area, forming the sort of the founding base, or the founders of the Haitian Vodou religion were drawn as enslaved people from that region. But then over the course of the decades into the 1720s and 1730s, the French slave trade shifts to West Central Africa, Angola, Congo, and other places. And so there you have those rites, the rituals and traditions from the Congo, Petwo, that are brought in underneath the umbrella of Service Guinéen. So you have an incredible absorptive system that emerges in Service Guinéen that consolidates all of these diverse, sometimes quite different traditions. Congo and Petwo are quite distinct in practice as ceremonies than Rada, but they're all brought under this Service Guinéen umbrella. So that is a long way of saying that all of that reflects much more than my book attempts. So specifically, I focus on the Bight of Benin, and I do not look at the Congo Central African contributions to Vodou, although they are as important, as significant, immensely beautiful, deserving attention, will receive attention. And some scholars are actually focusing on that part of the African inheritance in Haitian Vodou. So in this project, though, Rada and Gede are the main interests of mine, to the exclusion of, well, at least 19 other major rituals and traditions in the religion. So you're getting a small slice of the pizza here, to be honest. And try to be honest about that in the book and in the discussion. It's an immense, require multiple volumes to even begin to hope to scratch the surface on this tradition, which has thousands of sacred texts in the form of songs, hundreds of temples, probably 1 million dedicated followers too worldwide. I mean, to throw out a wild estimate.
It is interesting. For my part, Yoruba was definitely the one I was more familiar with before coming in contact with your book. And I think it's probably fair to say that in the US and in Europe, even just like a generalized idea of Yoruba might be more present, simply because an artistic tradition is born out of that in the 20th century. If you think of Picasso, especially, and his dependence on Yoruba art, in his own art. So I think that there's an aesthetic recognition that people may have to that without even realizing why. Just as a footnote I'll throw into there for my part.
Absolutely. I mean, Yoruba civilization and language and culture is dominant in the region that I study. So even though I don't focus on Yoruba religious traditions in the book, that culture and the empire of Oyo is constantly in conflict with the kingdom of Dahomey. And so the wars, the internecine slave raiding, the conflict regarding trade and access to the coast, those are major political issues that drive slave trading, slave raiding, the sales of captives. And so, Dahomey and Oyo, the Yoruba empire, are driving a lot of the slave trading and the conflict regionally. So although it's not a major part in terms of my focus on religion, it's such a huge part of the political story of how West Africans arrived in Haiti and the Caribbean. That conflict between kingdoms is such a driver behind the scenes. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was simply going to say, and that's something that has not really been adequately explored, the political machinations of the African kingdoms in the Bight of Benin, their own involvement in the slave trade, their own profiteering, the profiteering of the king, the king's administrators, the armies of those kingdoms, particularly the Dahomeans, but really all of the major kingdoms of that region drew immense profits from slave trading. And all of that is tied into Vodou to the extent that the royalty in those kingdoms practiced a type of royal religion, a royal Vodou. So all of that is sort of obfuscated or overlooked in Haitian studies and in Haitian treatments of Vodou. So that's an area that I wanted to explore because it explains a lot about the conditions of enslavement, the places where people were enslaved, why they were enslaved. So the mechanisms of enslavement, which were very diverse and complex, from debtors being enslaved to criminals being enslaved to the families of people who are convicted being enslaved. So there's so many enslavers, so many conditions of enslavement. Of course, centuries of this practice, but much of it overlooked in Haitian studies, almost as if it is a taboo. So, I wanted to smash the taboo involving the interracial slave trading system, the multiracial slave trading system. I mean, and that's something Caribbean people know very well, actually,
What's funny, as you were speaking that, I wrote down the word mulâtre, and I was just like, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but the idea of the mulâtre class that forms in the middle of the 18th century and its relationship to slavery and its interferences in the Middle Passage here, I think is absolutely right. I think you have some massive implications to this as a contemporary study that hasn't really been addressed.
It has not been addressed except by Africanists. Africanists have been diligent about exploring the involvement of African kingdoms in this slavery system, in the provisioning of enslaved people to European traders. I mean, if you take the kingdom of Dahomey, no European could enter that kingdom. And if they did, it was under a very strict escort. So the Dahomeans were enslavers. The Dahomean kingdom, their army, were enslaving neighboring vulnerable communities. They were attacking the Mai. They completely eliminated the Gedevi people from the Abomey Plateau. So chapter 4 is about this population, the Gedevi people. They're a Yoruba population that had themselves driven Aja people out of the Abomey Plateau. So you have populations moving in and others marching out. The Aja remembered that they controlled this region. As the Europeans surged in the 17th century, so the 1650s, 1670s, this provoked so much anxiety and so much violence on the coast. So many Aja people decided to seek refuge in the hinterland where their ancestors had once lived, the Abomey Plateau, which is, about 100 kilometers from Alada, not far in contemporary distances. And so this group of Aja migrants came to blows with the Gedevi people, and over multiple generations conquered them, intermarried with the women, and then ultimately enslaved and sold threatening males. Hypothetically, right? Obviously children were sold and women were sold. Villages were sold. Some people were kept. In the course of the decades that the Gedevi people were depleted from the Abomey Plateau and were transported to places like Haiti, where they were able to reconstitute their culture and integrate it with Sevis Guinée. So we have probably the strongest memory of the Gedevi people globally is in Haiti today. So many of them were taken from their homeland in the Abomey Plateau. So you barely find traces of them today. I mean, if you do enough research on the internet, you do find that there are ethnic Gedevi people in Benin still, in small numbers, but very little trace remains. So that that's one example.
And you get, I mean, it furthers when they do get to Saint Domingue or Haiti, in that. So real quick, European history for everybody. This is established during a time period called the Fronde, which you want to think of Louis XIV, if you're thinking of the French slavers, and then post-Fronde, which is when he comes into power. It's continued in present-day Haiti, at its time Saint Domingue, and a lot of other Caribbean states. So that's where we're situating ourselves now, is in this area of the Caribbean that's largely a French colony. There's Spanish colonies, there's English colonies. As well that are slaver colonies. But for this discussion, we're sort of focusing in on the French colony of Saint Domingue or Haiti. So that's a footnote for the viewers. So if we're thinking about it post-Fronde, so if we're moving into the 18th century, right, you see the laws of marriage, of European marriage, change also in relationship to the establishment of this mulatresse class, which it's sort of like in order to populate the places, right? And the way it's initially tried to solve is that the French government sends over like the dregs that they've arrested, the women, like so prostitutes and thieves and things. And the colonists are like, I don't want to marry them. So they end up marrying some of the enslaved women from this. And then you get another class of people. And it's an interesting socioeconomic study unto itself. So I'm curious in relationship to that, because France is still obviously highly Catholic, right? France stays Catholic till 1791 when it secularizes, so we're ways from that. And they also declare they abolish slavery the year after. So I'm curious in terms of further intermarriage with European slavers in relationship to Voodoo. What are the changes and stays within this class that forms in Haiti? And perhaps then, as a secondary question, what is the legacy of that as it moves and disseminates further?
Right. So in terms of the mixed race people who gradually arise in Saint-Domingue from interrelations, baby marriage, lots of concubines. Concubinage is a famous sort of relational practice in the colony. Rape, a lot of predation, sexual predation, tons of abuse in the colony. So the circumstances for the appearance of the mixed race population is the circumstances, I should say, are incredibly complex and diverse. On the one hand, you have stories of French fathers, taking mixed race women or African women as partners, as wives, as concubines, recognizing in many instances the children born of those relationships. In many instances, those children inherit the wealth of the French father. Many of those children, the ones who are recognized, speak French. They might have mixed racial phenotypes, but they are culturally French. They are bilingual at the very least. They speak the French of their father. They speak the Creole of the colony. So, I mean, this is the class. This is the early period for the emergence of Haiti's ruling class, which today, in many instances, are the descendants of mixed race people of Saint-Domingue, whose parents had wealth, whose parents had plantations, sugar, coffee, indigo plantations that they inherited. And consider the fact, and you no doubt know this, that in the south of Saint-Domingue, the mixed race people were, the majority slave owners. They owned the majority of slaves in that part of the country. So, and the French colonists, of course, like the Afrikaners in South Africa during apartheid, used that phenotypical feature of the mixed race people, that lightness, to give them privileges, to build a wall so that they would participate in forming a wall against the Black Creole speaking masses. So it's a divide and conquer. So the white South Africans brought the Asian community into the apartheid scheme of differing privileges depending on phenotype. Indian South Africans had more privileges than Black South Africans. So, you see this repeating. The French, in Saint-Domingue, they did that. And of course, they did it to a highly machined degree, in the sense of having every degree of Blackness and whiteness charted out legally. But in any event, the fact that you have at least 500,000 to 700,000 enslaved people, Black enslaved people, and roughly 30,000 Frenchmen and 30,000 mixed race people, given those demographics, you can see why the French would be so concerned about consolidating their strength with the mixed race people to oppose the Black masses, not to mention the fact that they were their own children.
And it will eventually fail. It collapses at the end of the 18th century, right? In revolution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It collapses, of course. And, and it's grossly unfair of me and anybody to treat any of these groups as homogeneous groups, essentialized in any way. You have mixed race Haitians fighting with Black Haitians for independence, to abolish slavery. You even have white French citizens fighting with Haitians, with Black and mixed race Haitians. Few in number, so we shouldn't exaggerate. But the mixed race community in particular is quite, complex politically, and many of the early leaders came from that community. Alexandre Pétion, for example, was one of the early presidents of the Republic. Boyer in the 1820s, another mixed race Haitian, who not only did he run the country for 2 decades, he also liberated the enslaved people in the Dominican Republic, something he is hated for by many Dominicans to this day, not for that particular reason, but for the occupation of the Dominican Republic. So, the mixed race people of Saint-Domingue and Haiti have made incredible contributions to Haitian sovereignty, Haitian culture, Haitian independence, including getting back to Vodou, serving as priests, as initiates, as members of the religion. So, of course, Haitian Vodou is more closely connected to Black Haitians, to the descendants of Africa. There's no question about it. But the thing is, the religion became creolized.
Right.
It's like nobody's speaking Fon and Ewe and Kikongo in Haiti. It's a Creole religion. All of the spirits terminology traditions have been creolized and made intelligible to anyone who speaks the language, including mixed race people. So there's nothing preventing them except their own inclination. And so we also read reports, of the 18th century describing white people who become immersed in Vodou and who are impacted by the spirits. And that's during the colony. Moreau de Saint-Méry, for example, in his famous report, describes how some white people are deeply impacted by the drumming and by the culture of Vodou. Others are not, particularly the police. Go figure. He literally says that the police aren't influenced by Vodou. That's not true. They truly
yeah,
are.
right. That they know of.
Well, I can tell you, if you go to Vodou ceremonies in Miami, you will see Miami police there. And it's not to make problems. It's just part of the culture,
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious because this I don't know much about because I was more when I studied this I was studying the politics a lot more than I was studying the cultural religious side, and so I'm curious. As the dominant religion of the colony would default be Catholicism by being a state of France under a royal governor. How much oppression was present in relationship to this traditional religion and this evolving umbrella religion that obviously is going to pick up more under its umbrella at this point?
Yeah, that's a really interesting historical question. And people like Kate Ramsey in her book, the spirits and the law, gets into that in quite some detail. So looking at it from a legal point of view is one of the best ways of tracing how the state evolved with respect to Vodou. So 1685, Code Noir, the Black Code, is pretty harsh, in the sense of only Roman Catholicism is legal tender in the colony, and there shall be no Jews and no Protestants. The weird thing is there's barely a mention of African and African diaspora traditions. It's as if the French didn't even understand them to be religions. And they sort of treat them in the early legal language as superstitions. So they have a pejorative, degrading, disposition, attitude toward these religions in their legal writing. The thing is, you have guys like François Macondal, who uses his knowledge of plants and of poisons to kill off a lot of the colonists and their livestock. So and he is known to be an Ungan, so a Vodou priest. So he's combining his knowledge of flora and of plants and fungi with spirituality. And he's also famous for distributing poisons so that others can wipe out some colonists and enslavers. And there was a huge panic around what he was doing and its relationship to this empowering African religion that brought diverse people together and consolidated them and gave them strength and reasons to fight. So that's really scary. It's like, thinking about the relationship of Islam and warfare. It's scary. If you're on the front lines in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, thinking about something that we can relate to, right? Like those fighters, the Taliban, the jihadists, they have some conviction that is deeply rooted in religion, right? Same with the Vodou fighters. That the religious zeal and inspiration is hard. It's hard to stop, right? And our own troops know that too well. Like these are people who are willing to give their life to God or to the spirits, no problem, and the cause is good too. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, Matthew.
Well, I'll take you on a different one because I kind of want to pause in the middle here because we're in the middle of my section 3, which is actually a good spot for us to be. Because one other thing that's kind of curious happens in this in Western tradition, and that becomes the fetishization of the object as opposed to what it's for. I mean, I don't want to get too Heideggerian here. What it's for versus what it's appreciated to be. So you have one set that ties it to a religious belief and the other decontextualizes it. We would probably know this better today as Orientalism. So what we see then in this time period is some of these objects become collected, right? If you go to the British Museum, for instance, more so than in France, oddly enough, you have a lot of these objects. And the problem becomes that they still imbue certain spiritual powers. Some women can't look at, some men can't look at, and they cause different issues. If you do, I mean, like impotence is obviously one of the more common things that looking upon the wrong spirit could cause. It is interesting, and I don't know per se, apart from just the traditional sort of like trophy of conquest fetish, which is what they seem to be by and large. But why does collectomania emerge without understanding? Because the understanding comes much later, right? It takes almost 100 and some more years before these objects are, as you said, they felt they were just superstitions. Like, so they just collected talisman. And I'm just curious where that sense of collectomania for these superstitions came from, and if you've come across any anecdotal stories or anything you'd like to share about that as we're in this middle part now.
Well, I mean, Europeans have been collecting the objects of the people that they conquer from the very beginning. I mean, I personally don't consider the use of talisman to be an expression of superstition. To me, it's more of a kind of folk religious practice. I'm not sure. To me, the word superstition is more of a sort of culturally biased way of defining practices that are misunderstood or ill understood. But like taking an example from my own background, I went to the British School of Brussels as a child between the age of 7 and 13. And right next to that school in Tervuren, there is the Royal Belgian Congo Museum. Now, Belgians were horrific colonists. I mean,
I'll pause here to recommend the book King Leopold's War.
It probably details the genocidal tragedy that befell the Congolese under Belgian colonialism. But this museum, I mean, I went to it many, many times growing up. So, and I've thought about it so much since. Like, what did all of that Congo art, what impact did it have on me as a kid? I mean, I went to that museum a couple times a year. It was walking distance from our school. We would just cut through the back and go in there with our classmates on school trips. It was just the most natural thing in the world. And they collected so much African art nkisi, spirit objects, inspirited objects, ritual objects, masks.
Nkisi was actually specifically what I was thinking of in all of this, right? Nkisi are these, usually they're, what is it? It's the Inkari, right? The two-headed alligator. Sometimes they're in the shape of a man, but they're filled with magic behind a mirror. And then if Ben and I were having a dispute, we would tap in a nail and agree not to fight each other via Zoom any longer. And if we lied, the medicine man would break the mirror, and the creature would the spirit of the creature would come and wreak vengeance or justice upon us. However you want to look at that is my best understanding of that.
Right. I mean, it's kind of catharsis. So, we can treat our ills and our, resentments with symbolic gestures. And so sometimes resolving these tensions within ourselves, within our communities, with people we're struggling with ritually, rather than resorting to violence, can resolve and heal some of these struggles. So that's how I understand some of these practices, the use of inkisi, hammering nails into these spirit objects. It's highly symbolic. And that symbolism has a kind of effect on the soul, on the mind, helping individuals process trauma or process a tragedy. So yeah, I tend to take some, have some appreciation for those expressions of religion, whether the talisman or statues or thunderstones, inspirited objects. They can have a powerful symbolic effect on people and help them.
So I want to transition now to part 4 because I promised you I'd keep the ship on time. So in my mind, we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at 3 main ports coming into the United States. We're looking at New Orleans, Charleston, and Boston in terms of where the majority of the slave auctions are going to be held and where people are going to be imported into the United States as we think of it now. I want to quickly underscore the idea of the French Navy during the American Revolution allowed for people to serve in the Navy as a perhaps chance to obtain freedom from being chattel, which is also going to lead to a spread in its own way, because some people are going to disperse. Some will stay in Haiti, some will travel to South America, North America. I mean, it's very dispersive where people choose to go post the American Revolution, who were enslaved and then became free. That's a whole dissertation unto itself and probably more. But I want to look at those 4 things, because there's a lot of implication, I feel like, depending where the body was transferred, because there's a huge difference culturally, particularly around dominance of religion in Boston versus New Orleans. And so maybe we should stick to those 2 for the sake of time, to create a juxtaposition between how the umbrella further changed as they're migrating further westward.
Right. Well, in terms of Louisiana, you have there a Creole culture, and of course that is the stronghold culture of the region until the Louisiana Purchase and the gradual Anglicization of that state, which is still going on, and driving French, Cajun, and Creole into extinction, nearly extinct. So, the relationship to Haiti is also fairly well established in terms of the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804, and the gradual outflow of French citizens of Saint-Domingue and the enslaved people that in many cases they took with them. And the story goes that many of them went through Cuba and then ultimately settled in New Orleans. So that infusion of people from Saint-Domingue also shapes Louisiana in a way that other cities would never, experience. So, obviously we have an ongoing connection to Vodou in Louisiana. We have a variety of the tradition that has emerged in a distinct form there and still is closely connected to Haitian Vodou. Sally Glassman, Mambo Sally Glassman in New Orleans was initiated in Haiti and took the initiatory traditions that she received from her parents, her initiation parents, from Haiti back to New Orleans. So there's still an ongoing infusion of Haitian culture, both through migration and from the citizens, the residents of that town engaging in Haitian studies and in Haitian Vodou, studies themselves. So it's quite distinct. But of course, since the 1960s, the Haitian diaspora has also arrived in Boston. Today, there are several important Vodou houses in Boston and several, of course, in New York City. New York City is probably next to Miami, the major urban hub of US-based Vodou or African diaspora traditions, of course. It would include Santeria, Palo Monte, Chongo from Trinidad, Condomble from Brazil, Brazilian immigrants in New York City, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of traditions on the East Coast. So yeah, definitely say the East Coast, from Louisiana up to Boston, we're talking about really the stronghold for urban African diaspora religious traditions today. So
it's interesting too, because in terms of how we probably pop culturally think of it, if we think to certain touchstones, one that we might think of is from Arthur Miller's The Crucible and the character of Tituba, who does make this full America's transition, right? Because she's actually more likely not actually African. She grows up in the tradition, but is more likely indigenous South American, if you look at the original accounts from the trials, but clearly practicing some version of Vodou. But as you say, it does have this expansive, and the further west it goes, the umbrella is just getting wider and wider, right? Which is interesting and very well covered in terms of like the various pinpoints in your book. But for the average viewer, I'm going to say that might be one of these touchstone points. And it is interesting to see it come into conflict with extreme Protestantism in the late 17th century, because it just gets denigrated purely into witchcraft, and also a strange reading of witchcraft. Like it's neither Christian nor Vodou in how it's read, by the point that it's read in the Salem witch trials as this incident that starts them.
Yeah. No, I have not really explored the treatments of European pagans or accusations of paganism among Europeans, but I certainly believe that it can be constructive and also insightful to compare and contrast the traditions like paganism, European paganisms. It's an immense field. If we're talking about Roman paganism of antiquity, Greek paganism of antiquity, or Irish, Celtic, pagan traditions, which many have been lost. So I do think it can be constructive to compare them with African diaspora traditions in terms of religious typology. I also think it's constructive to compare the religions of, indigenous Americans. So, for example, Amazonian spiritual traditions of, for example, the Baniwa Arawak people, to take one example, with Haitian Vodou. So I think there's a lot that we can learn by comparing and contrasting, but constantly remaining aware of differences and acknowledging them, avoiding simplistic conflations, which is tempting in the sense that we came from Africa. Like scientists said, we came from Africa. There's this thing called the single origin African hypothesis, whereby the humans on this planet dispersed from Africa. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And it took place like 150,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, which by my timekeeping was yesterday. So to me, there should be deep primordial African features that disseminated around the world into the cultures that now inhabit the face of the planet. So that's sort of an assumption that I do not completely. I mean, it's impossible to prove, but
Sure.
it's an intuition that I think is worth keeping in mind as we explore religions typologically.
But it gives us a good transition towards this this last idea of what has happened to transition voodoo into what it's commonly perceived as. And I'm going to go to a limb, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. I would imagine something like The Serpent and the Rainbow from the 80s probably did more harm to a religion than any, I mean, especially voodoo, than any other singular text probably did to that religion.
Completely agree with you. And I think it's astonishing that Wade Davis would write a book like that and then sell the rights to the film to a horror film producer. I mean, and keep his job as one of the leading individuals at National Geographic. I mean, still to this day. I mean, and he's done a lot of good work too, which is the difficult thing about the negative impact that book has had. I mean, I think it is a very exploitative film, and it does malign Vodou and portray it as demonic and other murderous. So it's a slanderous film, and the book had its own slanderous features. So I think you're absolutely right that this is a huge ongoing problem that reflects a culture of racism and essentialism and anti-Blackness. And so my book and my work has been to counter that and to demonstrate that this is profoundly rich and is equal to anything else in terms of religion, textually, practically, ceremonially, philosophically, theologically. That this tradition has, lacks absolutely nothing. And the only explanation for viewing it otherwise must reflect bias, a racism, which is very well attested for the history of the United States. So, we are thoroughly immersed in our bias, prejudice, racism, and when it comes to religion, it's as if those prejudices are authorized because of the kind of blanket authority and confidence that faith fills people with. Where they can hate on other religions because the intolerance is so sort of structurally inherent to religious fanaticism or even just belief. So yeah, it's big problem, and for Haitian Vodouists, they deal with this constantly in Haiti and in the United States, although there are islands of tolerance. And in cities like Miami, you can almost glimpse an America where diverse traditions coexist. So there's a good side to this.
Well, I think ending on a good note is a good place. And we've scratched the surface. We gave an interesting survey. I do recommend the book to you, The Transatlantic History of Haitian Voodoo, by our guest tonight, Dr. Hebblethwaite. I want to invite everyone to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now, and tune in tomorrow night for Dr. Sarah Burns. And to remind you, as always, to stay spooky. Thank you so much. I hope I did some navigatory justice to getting a point across.
Oh no, I enjoyed it. That was good. Yeah, I think it was nice to have some exchange rather than more of a monologue. If
Sure.
That's what your other guests did.
We get everything. I mean, I do interviews all the time. I do discussants all the time. I mean, it's probably, if you look at the grand, because this is probably show 80 or so at this point. And if you look at them, I mean, it's probably an even split between interviews and talks.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot.
It is.
It's a lot of content.
It's been
Gotta
an interesting
sell.
research project.
Okay, do you get some revenues from the
No.
streaming?
No.
Too small at this point?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, it's also an educational tool, like is how we really view it. We know a lot of people are using it in different classes and things, and that's really rewarding. I'm also just like, I don't know, I'm a lifelong learner, so I get to learn more about different things, and I think becoming more and more versed in all things under the idea of horror, or that have been transmuted into horror.
Yes.
From this, and it's been helpful in a lot of ways. I mean, we are getting book deals and things out of it, so not the worries.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, remember, you have to write the book though.
It is being written.
Oh, okay.
I should be writing right now.
4 books though? I mean, how?
Well, the one is like a coffee table, based